The morning light spilled softly through the tall glass windows of the concert hall, catching tiny flecks of dust in the air. A long line of young pianists waited near the registration desk, each holding their music sheets and wearing their best formal clothes. Among them stood a small, quiet girl from Japan. Her black hair was neatly tied in a simple braid, her white blouse carefully pressed, and her old shoes shined as best as she could. She looked nervous, but there was a calmness about her too, like someone who had already made peace with whatever might come. The other contestants glanced at her now and then. Most of them were chatting loudly, some checking their phones, others practicing finger movements in the air. The girl stood silently at the corner, clutching a worn leather music folder to her chest. She didn't seem to know anyone there, and no one tried to talk to her either. She had arrived alone after a long flight from Tokyo, carrying just one suitcase and a heart full of dreams. When her number was called at the registration table, she stepped forward carefully, bowing slightly as she handed her documents. The woman at the desk smiled politely but quickly moved on to the next participant. No one there knew how far this girl had come, or how much effort it had taken just to stand in that hall. To them, she was just another competitor, quiet, shy, and forgettable. Inside the hall, the sound of a grand piano echoed faintly. A contestant was performing their piece, and the audience listened with mild applause at the end. The judges, sitting at a long table covered with white cloth, scribbled notes with serious faces. Their suits looked expensive, their expressions professional but slightly tired. They had been sitting for hours, listening to young pianists from all over the world, some brilliant, some average, a few completely unprepared. When they saw the name of the next performer on the list, a few of them exchanged quick glances. They noticed the name sounded foreign, and one of them whispered, "Another beginner from overseas, I guess." They didn't mean to be cruel, but their tone carried a quiet disbelief that someone so young and small could surprise them. Outside the hall, the girl sat on a bench, listening to the muffled sounds of the piano. Her hands were folded on her lap. She could feel her heart beating too fast and her stomach felt tight. She took a deep breath and reached into her bag and pulled out a small charm, a tiny folded paper crane, slightly faded from years of being carried around. It had been given to her by her grandmother before she passed away. The girl smiled softly, touching the crane between her fingers. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "When you play, don't think about the people watching. Just speak through the music. Let the piano tell your story." Her number was called. She stood up quickly, smoothing her skirt and clutching her music sheets. As she walked toward the stage door, she could hear faint laughter from some contestants behind her. One said quietly, "She looks so nervous. I hope she remembers the notes." Another chuckled. She didn't turn around. She had learned long ago that silence was stronger than any argument. A stage assistant met her at the side door, checking her name again. The assistant looked at her with a puzzled expression, perhaps unsure if this shy small girl was really ready to perform in such a major competition. "You're next," the assistant said kindly. "Good luck." The girl bowed slightly and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was barely above a whisper. As the door opened, a gentle hush spread through the audience. The girl walked onto the wide wooden stage, each step echoing faintly in the huge space. The grand piano waited under a soft spotlight at the center. It looked massive compared to her small frame. She bowed deeply toward the judges, then toward the audience. Her movements were careful, respectful, the kind that comes from a culture of discipline and humility. Some of the judges smiled politely, but others looked down at their notes. A few leaned back in their chairs, already preparing themselves for another predictable performance. From where they sat, she looked too fragile, too nervous, too ordinary. They couldn't see the strength hidden beneath that quiet face. She walked to the piano bench and sat down. Her feet barely touched the floor. She adjusted the height slightly, then placed her music folder gently on the stand. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment. She could hear faint whispers from the audience, the shuffle of someone's coat, the cough of a man sitting in the back. For a few seconds, she closed her eyes. Everything went still. In that silence, she remembered sitting beside her grandmother years ago in their small Tokyo apartment. The sound of the old piano, slightly out of tune, filled the tiny room. Her grandmother's hands were wrinkled but strong. "You don't need to be loud to be heard," she had said. You only need to play with truth. That memory gave her courage now. One of the judges cleared his throat impatiently, thinking she was taking too long. Another looked at his watch, and then she opened her eyes. Something about her gaze had changed. The shy, nervous girl who had walked onto the stage seemed to disappear. Her hands lowered to the piano keys, steady and calm. Before she played a single note, there was a moment of stillness so deep that even the air seemed to hold its breath. The judges, the audience, everyone waited. The first note hadn't yet been struck, but somehow, they could already feel something was different. The girl took one more breath and whispered softly under her breath, not for anyone to hear, just for herself. For you, Grandma. At that instant, the hall lights shimmered faintly against the polished black piano, and her fingers pressed the keys with a delicate touch. The first note floated through the hall like a small, clear bell. It was soft but steady, full of emotion that seemed far older than her age. Every sound carried weight like it came from a place deep inside her. The judges stopped writing. Their pens froze midair. The audience leaned forward slightly, unsure why this simple beginning felt so powerful. And just like that, the quiet girl who had been ignored moments ago began to draw everyone into her world. A world built entirely of sound. No one knew yet what would follow. But one thing was certain. The room was no longer the same. The judges who had smirked earlier found themselves unable to look away. Something about her presence, around that stillness, that grace, had begun to shift the energy of the entire hall. The whispers faded, the laughter outside was forgotten, and all that remained was the girl, the piano, and the beginning of something extraordinary. The first few notes from the piano filled the hall like soft sunlight pouring through a window. The melody was gentle at first, quiet enough that the audience had to lean forward to catch every sound. Then slowly it began to build. The small girl's hands moved gracefully over the keys, her fingers dancing in perfect rhythm. There was no hesitation, no shaking. Every note landed with purpose, like she had rehearsed not for weeks but for years, every day, every night, without anyone watching. The judges sat upright now. Their earlier smirks had faded. One of them leaned slightly toward another, whispering something under his breath, but his eyes never left the piano. The music wasn't just good. It was alive. It carried emotion that felt impossible for someone her age to express. It was as if she wasn't just playing the piano, she was speaking through it. Her face stayed calm, almost expressionless, but her body moved with the rhythm. Each breath matched the flow of the music. Her shoulders lifted and fell naturally with every shift in tone. Sometimes her eyes closed for a moment, as though she was lost inside the story she was telling. Through sound, the piece she had chosen wasn't easy. A classical work that most young pianists avoided. Because of its complex timing and emotional range, even professionals sometimes struggled with it. When she had first announced her choice at registration, one of the organizers had blinked in surprise. But now as she played, it became clear why she had chosen it. This piece seemed made for her, or maybe she had made herself for it. In the audience, some people had started recording on their phones, too caught up to care about the competition rules. The sound was mesmerizing. It carried both strength and fragility, like the feeling of watching waves crash against rocks and then fade gently into foam. No one in the room expected it. No one imagined that the quiet, shy girl who walked so carefully onto the stage could create something this powerful. Behind the judges' table, one of the older men, who had been part of the competition for over 20 years, slowly removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes as though trying to be sure he wasn't imagining what he was hearing. The tones that flowed from the piano reminded him of his early days, when music was pure and unpolished, when it came straight from the heart. He looked at her again and whispered, "This one is special." The girl didn't notice any of that. She was lost in her world. Her hands moved faster now, crossing and uncrossing, the notes weaving into one another like threads in a beautiful fabric. Her small body leaned forward slightly as she reached the most difficult part of the piece, a section known for breaking even experienced players. The audience held their breath. The judges exchanged anxious glances. One of them looked as though he couldn't decide whether to keep taking notes or just listen. Then it happened. Her fingers flew across the keys with breathtaking precision. The sound rose, filling the hall with energy so powerful that it almost felt alive. There was no fear in her movement, no hesitation. Every touch was confident, every pause intentional. It was like watching someone speak a language they were born knowing, but had never had the chance to share. A few people in the audience gasped quietly. The hall had over 200 seats, but you could have heard a pin drop. The only sound was the piano, and the emotion pouring out of it. It wasn't just skill that impressed them. It was honesty. There was something in her playing that touched everyone differently. For some, it felt like remembering something long forgotten. For others, it felt like healing. One of the younger judges, who had earlier smiled mockingly when she walked in, now found himself unable to look away. He had judged hundreds of competitions, but this moment was unlike anything he'd seen. The way her small fingers moved, so light yet so strong, reminded him that music wasn't about perfection. It was about soul. He felt a lump in his throat, and for a second he forgot to breathe. As the melody softened again, she slowed her pace. Her shoulders relaxed, and her expression grew tender. She pressed the final set of chords with such emotion that it seemed the air itself trembled. Each sound lingered for a heartbeat before fading into silence. When the last note finally died away, she didn't move. Her hand stayed on the keys for a moment, as if saying goodbye to the song she had just shared. No one clapped right away. The hall was silent, completely silent. People looked at one another, unsure what had just happened. Then slowly the audience began to rise to their feet. The sound of applause broke the silence, soft at first, then louder and louder still. Within seconds, the entire hall was standing, clapping, cheering. Some even shouted, "Bravo!" The judges, usually composed and distant, were clapping too, a few of them standing in disbelief. The girl stood up from the bench and turned to face them. Her face was calm again. Her expression almost shy, but her eyes glistened with quiet emotion. She bowed deeply, hands folded at her front, then lifted her head slightly. She seemed unsure what to do with the overwhelming applause. It was too much, too sudden. She had played for her heart, not for attention, and now she was standing in front of hundreds of people who couldn't stop clapping. One of the judges leaned toward another and said softly, "I think we just witnessed something we'll remember for the rest of our lives." The older judge next to him nodded, still wiping his eyes. "I've seen thousands of performances," he said quietly, "but not one like this." As the applause continued, she bowed again, even deeper this time. Her small figure under the bright stage light looked almost fragile, yet there was strength in her stillness, a kind of dignity that didn't come from pride, but from humility. She smiled slightly, the kind of smile that comes when you know you've given everything you could. When she stepped off the stage assistant who had earlier doubted her stood frozen. "That was incredible," he said softly. She nodded politely, whispering a quiet, "Thank you." As she walked down the hallway toward the waiting area, she could still hear the echo of clapping behind her. It felt distant now, almost unreal. In the waiting room, the other contestants stared at her as she entered. A few of them avoided eye contact. Others looked at her with admiration and disbelief. One boy who had earlier laughed at her simple clothes now stood up and said awkwardly, "That was amazing, really." She smiled shyly, bowing a little before sitting down. She didn't say anything. Words felt unnecessary. She took a small sip of water, her hands finally relaxing. Her heart was still beating fast, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from relief, from joy. She had done what she came to do. She had played for her grandmother, for her own promise, for the love of music itself. Everything else, the applause, the stares, the whispers, didn't matter as much. Back in the main hall, the judges were still talking about her performance. They went over their notes, but most of them didn't know what to write. "How could you measure something that went beyond technique?" One of them said. "We can't judge this by points. That wasn't just a performance, and it was a story." The others nodded quietly in agreement. The competition continued afterward, but it felt different now. Every contestant who came after her had to play under the heavy shadow of what she had just done. The audience listened politely to the rest, but their minds were still with that small girl and her breathtaking performance. Even the piano itself seemed quieter after she left the stage, as if it too needed time to rest. Later that evening, as the results were being prepared, she sat alone in the corner of the hall, gently running her fingers over the folded paper crane she always carried. She didn't know if she would win or not, and it didn't matter much to her. All she wanted was to honor the promise she had made years ago, that one day she would play on a stage where her grandmother could hear her, even from the stars. Outside, the sky had turned a deep blue. The lights of the city sparkled faintly through the glass windows. The hall that had once felt so intimidating now felt peaceful. She looked around quietly, taking in the faces of people talking and laughing, unaware of how much this day had changed her life. She thought of her grandmother again, the old piano in their apartment, the lessons filled with patience and love, the quiet words of encouragement, and she smiled softly to herself. Whether she won or not, she knew she had already succeeded. She had found her voice. She had played with her heart, and somewhere, perhaps far above, the woman who had believed in her first was smiling too. The hall had grown quiet again after the long round of performances. Contestants sat scattered around the waiting area, some whispering nervously, others pretending to look calm. The air felt heavy, filled with that strange tension that always comes before results are announced. Somewhere down the hall, the sound of footsteps echoed. Judges moving between rooms, organizers whispering, papers shuffling. The girl sat in a corner, her small hands folded on her lap. Her music folder rested beside her, its edges slightly worn. She had already played her piece, already given her heart. Whatever was coming next, she was ready for it. A volunteer walked in and handed her a cup of water. "You were amazing out there," he said quietly, smiling. She looked up, surprised, and thanked him softly. Compliments always made her a little shy, especially from strangers. She didn't know that half the hall was still talking about her. In another room, behind closed doors, the judges were in a long discussion. One of them tapped his pen against the table. "I've never seen anything like that," he said. She played as if the music lived inside her. Another nodded. "It wasn't just technique," he added. It was truth, but not all judges agreed right away. One of the younger ones spoke carefully. "Yes, it was emotional. But this is a competition. We also need to consider structure, interpretation, the original score." The older judge interrupted him gently. "We've heard perfect scores all day, flawless technique, but nothing that made this room go silent like that girl did. You saw their faces. You heard that applause?" The younger judge paused, realizing he was right. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the head judge leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Her playing reminded me why we started this in the first place. Music isn't about showing off, it's about connection. That girl connected with every soul in this room." They nodded slowly, understanding. The discussion turned from technicalities to emotion, from scoring systems to sincerity. They knew they had witnessed something rare, something that went beyond rules or expectations. Meanwhile, in the waiting hall, the girl pulled out her small paper crane again. It was her quiet ritual. She held it in her palm, pressing it gently between her fingers. It made her feel close to home. It made her feel calm. One of the other contestants, a tall boy from France, walked over hesitantly. He looked a bit embarrassed, scratching the back of his neck. "Hey," he said, I just wanted to say your performance was beautiful." I was backstage. "Everyone stopped what they were doing when you started playing." She looked up, blinking in surprise. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. The boy smiled awkwardly, not sure what else to say, then walked away. But inside she felt something warm, not pride exactly, but gratitude. An hour passed before the announcement came. A woman stepped onto the stage, holding a small envelope. "Thank you all for your patience," she said into the microphone. "The judges have reached their decision." The contestants gathered near the stage, their faces tense with expectation. The audience began filling back into the seats, whispering excitedly. Everyone wanted to know who the mysterious girl from Japan was, the one who had stunned the judges and the crowd alike. The woman opened the envelope. "In third place," she read, "goes to..." Applause followed. "In second place..." More clapping. Then a pause, a long, deliberate pause. The girl felt her heartbeat quicken. Not because she wanted to win, but because the silence felt so heavy. "And in first place," the announcer continued, "for her breathtaking performance that moved both the judges and the audience." The woman smiled, scanning the paper once more. "What, the award goes to contestant number 17. For a second, the hall stayed still. Then someone near the back whispered, "That's her," and the applause began again, louder than before. The girl blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. Contestant 17, that was her number. The stage assistant gestured for her to step forward. She rose slowly, almost unsure if her legs would carry her. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but disbelief. As she walked toward the stage, the applause continued, echoing through the high ceilings. She bowed deeply before accepting the small gold medal and certificate. The head judge, standing beside the announcer, shook her hand and said quietly, "Never lose that honesty in your music. It's rare." She nodded, bowing again, unable to speak. When she returned to her seat, some of the other contestants clapped for her genuinely, while others stayed silent, lost in their own thoughts. But she didn't notice. Her mind was elsewhere, back home with the memory of her grandmother smiling beside the old piano. After the ceremony ended, a few people approached her. A journalist asked if he could interview her for a music magazine. A teacher from a conservatory offered to mentor her. But she only smiled politely and said she needed some time to think. All she really wanted at that moment was quiet, a moment to breathe, to take it all in. Later that evening, she stepped outside the concert hall. The sky above Vienna was a deep shade of indigo with tiny stars beginning to appear. The cool air brushed her face gently. She sat on the stone steps outside, holding the small paper crane again. The city lights shimmered in the distance, reflecting off the river nearby. Her mind replayed everything: the whispers, the smirks, the music, the silence, the applause. It all felt like a dream. She thought about how she had once practiced on an old piano that was missing 2 keys, how her grandmother would listen with closed eyes, humming softly. "Play from here," she would say, touching her chest. "Not from here," she'd add, tapping her forehead. Those words had guided her every day, and tonight they had brought her to this moment. As she sat there, one of the judges came walking out of the hall. It was the older man who had defended her in the meeting. He spotted her sitting quietly and walked over. "You know," he said gently, "I've been doing this for 40 years. I've heard so many performers. But what you did today, that was something I'll never forget." She looked up, startled, then bowed slightly. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. He smiled. "You reminded me that music doesn't need to be loud to touch hearts. Sometimes it's the quietest voice that says the most." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small program booklet. On the inside cover, he had written a note: "Never let the world make you doubt your gift." She accepted it with both hands, bowing again. "I won't," she said. When he left, she sat for a long time, just looking at the stars. The night air was cool, but she didn't feel cold. She felt peaceful. Back at her small hotel room, she placed the medal on the nightstand beside her bed. The paper crane rested next to it. She turned off the lights and lay down, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted between the past and the future, between who she was and who she might become. She knew that tomorrow people might talk about her performance, maybe even share videos online. Some would praise her, others might forget her, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that for one brief moment she had been truly seen, not for how she looked, not for where she came from, but for the music she carried inside. She closed her eyes and smiled. The memory of her grandmother's voice returned once more. "When your heart speaks through music, even the world must listen." Sleep came softly after that, the kind that feels like a gentle wave carrying you home. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the window, waking her slowly. She stretched and looked at the medal on the table. It gleamed faintly in the light. But she didn't reach for it. Instead, she picked up the paper crane and tucked it back into her bag. That was the real treasure, the reminder of where it all began. Downstairs in the lobby, the hotel manager congratulated her. "We saw you on the local news this morning," he said cheerfully. "They called you the quiet miracle." Her eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected that. People were really talking about her, not because of her name, but because of her music. Outside, as she walked through the city streets, a few strangers recognized her. One woman stopped her near a cafe and said, "You made me cry last night." "Thank you." The girl blushed, bowing slightly, unsure how to respond. It felt strange but beautiful, knowing her music had touched people she had never met. She continued walking, her steps light. The world around her looked brighter, more alive. Street musicians played violins on corners, and she paused to listen, smiling quietly. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged, not just in Japan, not just on a stage, but anywhere there was music. As the day went on, she promised herself one thing. She would keep playing, not for fame or awards, but for the same reason she always had, because music was the one language her heart spoke best. And though the world now knew her as the girl who had silenced a hall with her first notes, to her, she was still the same. A quiet soul with a paper crane in her hand and a song waiting inside her heart. The days that followed the competition felt like a dream the girl couldn't quite believe was real. Every morning when she woke up, she half expected to find herself back in her small room in Tokyo, where the sound of the city mixed with the soft creak of her grandmother's piano. But when she opened her eyes, she would see the metal shining faintly on the bedside table, and she'd remember it had all really happened. News of her performance spread faster than she could imagine. Videos recorded by audience members were being shared online, and people from different countries were leaving comments, calling her the Quiet Storm or the Soul Pianist. Reporters wanted to know more about the shy girl who had walked on stage like a whisper and left as a legend. She didn't know any of this at first. The morning after her performance, she had gone for a walk along the river, carrying a small bag with her paper crane inside. She liked the quiet of early mornings, when the world was still waking up and everything felt peaceful. She stopped at a bench overlooking the water and sat there for a long time, just watching the gentle ripples. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from one of the competition organizers. "Congratulations again. You've become an inspiration here. People keep asking about you." She stared at the screen, unsure what to reply. Inspiration, that was a big word. She didn't feel like one. She was just a girl who loved to play piano because it made her feel close to someone she missed. Later that day, the competition committee invited her for an interview. When she arrived, they had cameras, microphones, and bright lights set up. The interviewer smiled kindly and said, "You've touched so many hearts with your music. Can you tell us what inspired you?" She hesitated for a moment, then answered softly, "Someone I loved very much taught me that music doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be honest." Her voice was quiet, but everyone in the room listened carefully. She spoke simply, without big words or practiced phrases. Every answer felt genuine, the kind of truth that doesn't need decoration. When the interview ended, several people thanked her, saying her words were as beautiful as her performance. By evening, clips from the interview started to appear online. Comments poured in from people all over the world. Some wrote how her playing had reminded them of their childhood. Others said they cried listening to her music. A few musicians even said she had inspired them to play again after years of giving up. But the girl didn't spend much time reading comments. She preferred the quiet moments, sitting by the piano in the rehearsal room, playing softly to herself. She didn't play for the crowd. She played for the same reason she always had, because it made her feel alive. A few days later, the competition organizers hosted a small dinner for the winners. The judges were there, smiling warmly when they saw her. The older judge who had spoken to her after the performance walked over with a proud smile. "You've started something, you know," he said. "People are remembering what music is supposed to feel like." She blushed and looked down, unsure what to say. He continued gently, "Promise me you'll keep playing, not for applause, but for the love of it." She nodded. "I promise." During the dinner, musicians from different countries came up to greet her. Some asked to take pictures with her. Others just wanted to shake her hand. The tall boy from France, who had spoken to her before, raised a glass in her direction and said, "To the girl who reminded us what real music sounds like." Everyone clapped, and she smiled shyly, her cheeks warm with embarrassment. That night, as she walked back to her hotel, the streets of Vienna glowed under the yellow streetlights. The air smelled faintly of rain, and distant music drifted from a nearby cafe. She paused for a moment, listening. A pianist was playing an old tune, soft, slow, and full of feeling. She smiled, recognizing the same kind of honesty her grandmother had always spoken about. She whispered to herself, "Grandma, can you hear me?" "I did it." A few days later, it was time to go home. At the airport, several people recognized her and waved. A few asked for photos. She was surprised, a little shy, but she agreed, smiling politely. When the plane finally lifted off the runway, she looked out the window and watched the clouds drift by. Her heart was full, not just of happiness, but of peace. When she landed in Tokyo, the familiar scent of the city welcomed her, the mix of rain, tea, and faint traffic noise. Her parents met her at the airport, holding flowers and smiling proudly. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering, "We're so proud of you." Her father, who rarely showed emotion, just nodded with a gentle smile, but his eyes said more than words could. They drove home through narrow streets lined with lanterns. When they reached their small apartment, she stepped inside and froze for a moment. The old upright piano stood in the same corner it always had, covered with a soft white cloth. She walked over and gently ran her fingers along its edge. It felt exactly the same, warm, familiar, full of memories. Her mother said, "Play something just like you used to." She nodded and sat down. The stool creaked slightly as she adjusted it. She opened the piano lid and pressed a single note. The sound was softer than the grand piano in Vienna, but it was beautiful in its own way. She began to play slowly, the melody gentle and filled with emotion. Her parents stood in the doorway listening quietly. For her, it felt like coming home, not just to a place, but to a feeling. Every note carried memories of her grandmother, the lessons, the laughter, the patience, the love. By the time she finished, her mother's eyes were wet with tears. "That was beautiful," her mother said softly. The girl smiled, wiping a tear from her own cheek. "It was for her," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving from different countries, invitations to perform, to study, to record. Her story had traveled far beyond what she imagined. But she didn't rush to accept anything. She wanted to take her time. She wanted to grow slowly, just like her grandmother had taught her, one note at a time. Sometimes she would visit a small park nearby and play the piano there. It was an old outdoor piano placed under a cherry tree for anyone to use. Children would stop to listen. Old people would smile, and sometimes strangers would cry quietly without saying why. Each time she played, she felt her grandmother's presence beside her, not as a memory, but as something alive and warm. One afternoon, a young boy came up to her while she was playing. He stood quietly for a while, then asked, "How do you make it sound like that? Like it's talking?" She smiled at him and said softly, "Because it is talking. You just have to listen with your heart." The boy nodded seriously as if he understood and ran off to tell his friends. She watched him go, her heart light. As spring turned to summer, her life slowly changed. Music schools called, magazines wanted to feature her, and even a few famous pianists reached out. But she remained humble. She still took the train every morning, still practiced on the same old piano, still carried the folded paper crane in her pocket. Fame didn't matter. What mattered was the connection, the invisible thread that tied her heart to the piano and her grandmother's memory. One evening, she received a letter from the same judge who had written her a note in Vienna. It said, "The world needs musicians like you, the ones who remind us that silence between the notes is just as powerful as the notes themselves." She read it twice, then placed it beside her piano. That night, as the city lights flickered outside her window, she played a new piece she had been working on. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was honest. Each note carried a whisper of gratitude to her grandmother, to the people who had believed in her, and even to those who hadn't. Because in their own way, they had pushed her to shine brighter. When she finished, she closed her eyes and let the silence settle. It felt full, peaceful, alive. The next morning, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sunlight dance across the keys of her piano. She realized something then. The journey wasn't about winning or being noticed. It was about staying true to the voice inside her heart. And so, she promised herself once again, no matter how far her music would take her, she would always remain that same quiet girl, the one who walked onto a stage full of doubt, sat at a piano, and let her first notes speak louder than any words ever could. Months passed, and the shy girl's life began to change in quiet, beautiful ways. The world had seen her performance, and though she still lived humbly in the same small apartment, her name had reached places she'd never imagined. Letters arrived from across the globe, from children learning piano, from parents thanking her for inspiring their kids, from musicians who said she reminded them why they first fell in love with music. She read every letter carefully. Some made her smile, some made her cry. One came from a little girl in Italy who wrote, "When I feel scared before my recital, I remember how you looked calm even when people laughed. Then I'm brave like you." Another came from an old man in Canada who said her performance had reminded him of his late wife. These messages touched her deeply. She never thought something as simple as her love for music could reach so many hearts. Despite the attention, she stayed the same. Quiet, gentle, humble. She didn't see herself as famous. She still practiced every morning at the same piano her grandmother had left her. She still bowed her head before she played, whispering a small thank you to the person who had taught her everything that mattered. One morning, as she was practicing, she received an email from the Vienna Conservatory. It was an invitation to return, not as a contestant this time, but as a guest performer for their annual music gala. The message said, "We would be honored if you shared your gift once more on our stage." She sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. Part of her felt nervous, going back to the same place where everything began. But another part of her felt ready. She knew her grandmother would want her to say yes. So she replied with a simple message. "I would be honored to play." In the weeks that followed, she prepared quietly. She didn't choose a grand or complicated piece. Instead, she decided to play a new melody she had written herself, something soft and emotional, built from the sounds of her heart and memories. It didn't have a name yet, but she thought of it as the song of home. When the day finally came, she flew back to Vienna. This time, she wasn't the nervous girl walking through the corridors trying not to be noticed. People recognized her. Some waved. Some smiled. But she still felt that same quiet peace inside her. She wasn't there to prove anything. She was there to share something. Backstage, before her performance, the older judge from the competition came to greet her. His eyes were kind as always. "It's good to see you again," he said warmly. "Are you ready to play for us once more?" She smiled softly. "I think so." "This time I'm not afraid," he nodded approvingly. "Good. Remember, the piano doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for truth." When it was her turn, she walked onto the stage slowly. The hall looked the same as before, tall, elegant, golden lights shining above. But this time the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy or doubtful. It was full of expectation and warmth. As she sat down at the piano, she looked at the keys for a moment. Then she took a deep breath and began to play. The melody was tender and full of emotion, like a gentle conversation between her heart and the world. Every note carried a piece of her journey. The loneliness of her early days, the laughter with her grandmother, the pain of losing her, the fear of being judged, and the quiet strength she found within herself. The audience sat completely still. The sound filled the hall like light spreading through darkness. Some people closed their eyes. Others wiped away silent tears. Even the judges, who had heard hundreds of performances, looked deeply moved. When the final note faded into silence, she lifted her hands slowly from the keys and bowed her head. For a few seconds, there was nothing but stillness. Then the entire hall rose in a standing ovation. The applause echoed like thunder, but she didn't see it as noise. To her, it was the sound of hearts connecting. After the concert, many people came to her, but she didn't seek attention. She quietly thanked everyone, smiled softly, and went outside to breathe the night air. The city lights shimmered, and for a moment, she felt her grandmother's presence beside her again. She whispered, "I played your song, Grandma. I hope you heard it." From that day, her music reached even further. She received invitations to perform around the world, Paris, London, Seoul, New York, but she chose carefully. She didn't want to chase fame. She only performed where she felt her music could bring peace to others. One winter evening, she played at a hospital for children. The piano was old and slightly out of tune, but she didn't mind. As she played, the children listened quietly, their eyes wide. One little boy with a bandage around his head asked, "Miss, why does your music make my heart feel warm?" She smiled softly. "Because it's made from love," she replied. The nurses standing nearby had tears in their eyes. That performance never appeared on television, but to her, it was one of the most meaningful she had ever given. Back home in Japan, she continued to teach small music classes for children who couldn't afford lessons. She didn't charge much. Sometimes she even taught for free. Her goal wasn't to create prodigies. It was to help them find joy in music. One afternoon, as she watched a young student struggle with a difficult piece, she said gently, "Don't try to make it perfect. Just play what you feel. The piano will understand." The child tried again, and though the notes weren't perfect, they carried emotion. The girl smiled. "See? That's music," she said softly. Years passed quietly. Her name remained known, but she stayed humble, never letting fame change her heart. She continued to write her own music, gentle, emotional pieces that people said could make them both cry and smile at the same time. Her performances were always simple. No fancy lights, no long speeches, just her and the piano. One evening she received a letter from Vienna again. This time it was from the music academy that had hosted the competition years ago. They wanted to name a scholarship in her honor. The Scholarship for Honest Musicians. It would help young students who couldn't afford training but had a deep love for music. She was speechless when she read it. The thought that her journey could help others begin theirs filled her heart with joy. She wrote back saying, "Why, thank you. If this helps someone find their voice, that's the best honor I could ever receive." When the scholarship was announced, the first student chosen was a shy girl from a small village, a girl who reminded everyone of her. The story felt like it had come full circle. One evening, many years later, she sat alone in her small studio, looking at the old paper crane on her desk. It was a little faded now, but she still kept it close. She thought about her grandmother, the laughter, the lessons, the kindness. Outside, the rain began to fall softly. She smiled and whispered, "I kept my promise." Then she sat at the piano and began to play one last song, something soft, peaceful, and full of gratitude. She played for everyone she had met, for every child who dreamed, for every person who had ever felt small or unseen. The notes drifted through the open window into the night, carried by the wind like a message to the stars. Somewhere deep inside her heart she felt her grandmother smiling. Her journey had started with silence and people doubting her, misunderstanding her. But it ended with music, honest, pure, and full of life. And though many years would pass, her story would continue to inspire others, not because she became famous, but because she showed the world something rare, that true beauty doesn't shout, it whispers. That real talent doesn't demand attention, it earns it quietly, and that sometimes the softest voice in the room can create the loudest echo in the world.